It happened in an instant. 1 second, the Reiner family was alive, thriving, living in a home that, from the outside, seemed perfect. The next, everything shattered. By the time the authorities arrived, 2 lives were gone, and the world was left staring at a question that refuses to fade. How could this happen in one of Los Angeles's most affluent, safest neighborhoods? How could a family, celebrated, admired, seemingly unbreakable, be torn apart in a single night by a son, the very person who should have been their protector? But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. Imagine waking up to a Sunday morning like any other. The sun peaks over the horizon, brushing the trees of Brentwood with a golden glow. Birds chirp as if oblivious to the horror about to unfold, and a city that never truly sleeps hums with its usual rhythm. And yet, inside a home that had once echoed with laughter, love, and quiet family routines, silence had settled permanently. Rob Reiner, 78, and Michelle Singer Reiner, 70, were found lifeless by police on a sunny afternoon that no one would ever forget. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, had allegedly taken both their lives with a knife, a weapon that would now define the tragedy in headlines, discussions, and every news feed for weeks to come. From the moment investigators arrived at the Brentwood residence, the scene defied easy comprehension. For neighbors, friends, and the broader public, it was a reality that seemed ripped from a chilling crime drama. You might think, I know my family. This could never happen to us. But the Reiner story forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. No amount of wealth, status, or fame can insulate a family from unimaginable tragedy. At 3:40 p.m. on that fateful Sunday, authorities confirmed what no one wanted to believe. The bodies were discovered, each a stark, silent testimony to a night of violence. Rob and Michelle, pillars of their community, figures of public admiration, were gone. Their lives, abruptly erased, left only questions, and the unnerving sense that the answers might be darker than anyone could predict. By 9:15 p.m. that same evening, Nick Reiner had been located and arrested in the Exposition Park neighborhood of South Los Angeles. Within hours, what had begun as a horrifying morning transformed into a nationwide media frenzy. But before the public had time to process, the narrative had already splintered into fragments of chaos. Who could imagine that a son could go from smiling at family gatherings to facing charges of 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances? According to the Los Angeles County District Attorney, Nick Reiner had allegedly used a deadly weapon, a knife, and committed a crime that would leave the city and the country reeling. Special allegations, first-degree charges, the weight of the legal system descending like a storm. These are the words that capture the gravity of what had occurred, but even they feel inadequate when weighed against the sheer human devastation. It wasn't just the murder that shocked the public, it was the chilling precision of Nick's movements afterward. Security footage from Santa Monica shows him checking into a hotel early Sunday morning, mere miles from his parents' home. Later, a gas station convenience store captured his image moments before the arrest. Every step paints a picture that investigators are painstakingly piecing together, and every revelation leaves the public asking the same haunting question. What was going through his mind? What drove him to this? And more pressingly, what did he think would happen next? And then there was the party. Just one night before, sources reported that Rob, Nick, and other guests, including the famously witty Conan O'Brien, were present at a gathering that should have been ordinary, even jovial. Witnesses described a brief but intense argument between father and son. Laughter, conversation, and casual celebrity mingling gave way, for a fleeting moment, to tension, an argument that would later seem like a harbinger, a signpost pointing to a catastrophe no one anticipated. But a single argument cannot erase decades of familial love, or could it? That is the question that now looms over the story. Think about the contrast. A neighborhood known for its manicured lawns, celebrity homes, and the illusion of safety, against the stark brutality of a knife, used in anger, leaving 2 people dead. It's a juxtaposition that feels surreal. And yet, for law enforcement, this isn't fiction. It's a case that requires meticulous investigation, forensic analysis, witness interviews, and psychological profiling. Every decision, every movement, every detail is scrutinized, And yet the deeper the authorities dig, the more complex the picture becomes. For the public, the fascination is inevitable. It's the paradox of human curiosity, the desire to look away, and yet the compulsion to stare, to understand, to witness the unraveling of a family in real time. Social media lit up with speculation, theories, and the inevitable comparisons to fictional dramas. But this was no fiction. These were real people, real lives, and the real consequences of actions that defy logic. Friends, neighbors, and family members were left grappling with shock, disbelief, and grief. How do you reconcile love with violence? How do you explain a son turning against his own parents? The details we've already uncovered are just the beginning. Authorities are investigating Nick's movements, his state of mind, and the events leading up to the fatal morning. Forensic teams are analyzing every piece of evidence: knives, fingerprints, surveillance footage, and any other clues that can piece together what happened. Meanwhile, the media cycle has ensured that millions of people know the names, faces, and timeline. But knowledge alone doesn't provide understanding. It raises more questions than it answers. What triggered the violence? Were there warning signs we missed? Could this have been prevented? And the story doesn't end at the arrest. Reports have emerged that Nick Reiner's time in custody has already been marked by violence, an alleged stabbing incident inside prison, one that threatens not only his survival, but also the unfolding legal process. The shock of the initial murders is compounded by this new revelation, creating a sense of relentless tension that no one can ignore. What happened in that prison? Who attacked him? And why? Each new detail adds a layer to a story that seems to have no end, each chapter darker than the last. As we begin to peel back the layers of this story, it becomes clear that every moment, every decision, and every interaction matters. From the fateful party at Conan O'Brien's home to the police arriving at the Brentwood estate, every scene is part of a chain reaction. And while we are only beginning to understand what happened, one fact is undeniable. This is a tragedy that will haunt Los Angeles, the Reiner family, and everyone who dared to watch it unfold. The questions linger. How could Nick Reiner, a man known to friends and family, commit such an unthinkable act? What drove him to violence in a household that, on the surface, appeared loving and supportive? And perhaps most chillingly, what will happen next, both inside the prison system and in the courtroom? These are the questions we will attempt to answer, piece by piece, as we journey through the shocking, twisted story of the Reiner family tragedy. By the time we uncover every detail, every secret, and every revelation, one thing will become painfully clear: nothing is as it seems. The outward appearance of normalcy, of wealth, of familial love, can mask an inner world of tension, resentment, and darkness. And for Nick Reiner, the consequences of that darkness have already begun. And they may be more severe than anyone could imagine. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. They say you can tell a lot about a person by the house they live in. In the case of the Reiners, their Brentwood estate was a picture of perfection. Manicured lawns, tall hedges for privacy, and architecture that exuded both sophistication and comfort. It was the kind of home that could easily grace the cover of a magazine, the kind people drive past thinking, these people have it all. But as with many tragedies, appearances are deceiving. Behind those walls, behind the polished facade, was a family whose private life was far more complicated than the world ever imagined. Rob Reiner, 78, was a man whose name carried weight in Hollywood and beyond. Director, actor, writer. He had earned acclaim and respect, and yet, for all his professional achievements, nothing defined him more than his role as a father. Michelle Singer Reiner, 70, was equally remarkable. A figure who balanced strength with compassion, she was the quiet anchor of the family, the one who held the threads together when life threatened to unravel. Together, they projected a sense of stability, tradition, and love. To the public, to friends, to acquaintances, they were the ideal family. Nick Reiner, their 32-year-old son, grew up surrounded by privilege, opportunity, and expectations. From childhood, he had access to the best education, travel experiences, and exposure to influential figures in the entertainment industry. He moved in circles most could only dream of. Yet growing up under such intense scrutiny often has consequences. A childhood in the spotlight, even indirectly, comes with pressures that can shape someone in unpredictable ways. It is impossible to understand Nick without understanding the environment in which he was raised, a world of high expectations, where every action and every misstep could be scrutinized and judged. Neighbors often described Nick as polite, even reserved. Friends recalled a young man who could be charming, occasionally moody, and always ambitious. Yet beneath that veneer were hints of volatility, small incidents that, when viewed in hindsight, seem like premonitions of the events that would later unfold. Was it just teenage rebellion, the typical friction between father and son? Or were there deeper currents of tension that no one noticed? Those questions would haunt every investigation and every conversation about the Reiner family in the weeks that followed. Rob and Michelle had worked tirelessly to provide their son with opportunities, often encouraging independence, creativity, and ambition. But as with many families, love does not automatically prevent conflict. Discipline, expectations, and the weight of a family legacy can sometimes produce resentment. And while the public saw laughter, celebrations, and family gatherings, the private world was a different story. One marked by arguments that were quickly forgotten, moments of tension that seemed minor but lingered beneath the surface. It is easy to romanticize wealth and fame, but the Reiners' lives, while enviable, were also filled with the same challenges ordinary families face: disagreements, pressure, unmet expectations, and emotional turbulence. And Nick, navigating his own path as an adult, faced the combined pressures of family expectations and public scrutiny. He was no stranger to scrutiny. Every mistake, every lapse, even minor, could feel magnified. Friends reported moments when Nick seemed frustrated, withdrawn, or unusually sensitive to criticism. Were these signs of deeper emotional struggles? Perhaps. Or perhaps they were the normal growing pains of someone in a high-pressure environment. Despite these undercurrents, there were moments of genuine connection. Family dinners, holiday celebrations, and gatherings with close friends were frequent. Laughter was abundant, and photographs taken over the years depict smiles, affection, and a sense of togetherness. But even the happiest family has its shadows. Behind every smile, every handshake, every embrace, there can be hidden conflict, suppressed resentment, or unspoken tension. For Nick, adolescence and early adulthood brought both privilege and complexity. Access to influential circles provided opportunities, but also introduced comparisons, envy, and the challenge of defining himself outside of his father's immense legacy. Friends recalled instances of him feeling overshadowed, moments when praise felt insufficient or hollow. While some of these feelings are natural in any family, in a household of wealth, fame, and public expectation, they can be magnified. Interestingly, Nick's relationship with his parents was described as deeply layered. There was love, yes, but also friction, a push and pull common in many parent-child dynamics. He admired his father professionally and personally, yet disagreements arose. At times, Rob could be overbearing, demanding, or critical, a trait that many families share but one that can have significant consequences if left unresolved. Michelle, on the other hand, was the mediator, attempting to soften conflicts, maintain harmony, and provide emotional guidance. Yet even the most patient parent can be met with resistance, especially when a child is navigating adulthood, independence, and identity. Social circles also played a role in shaping the family dynamics. Nick moved among influential figures, mingling with celebrities, industry insiders, and peers with their own ambitions and pressures. These interactions, while enriching, added another layer of complexity to his life. Comparisons, envy, and the constant awareness of how one is perceived can exacerbate internal conflicts. Imagine trying to define yourself in a world where every success or failure is magnified, where mistakes are amplified, and where family expectations loom large. And yet, despite these pressures, outwardly, the Reiners appeared to function normally. Neighbors noted family outings, casual gatherings, and the kind of ordinary interactions that suggest nothing is amiss. To them, it was a stable, loving family. To friends, the Reiners' home was a place of warmth, tradition, and stability. But tragedy has a way of exposing the cracks that were invisible to the outside world. As the days following the murders would reveal, those cracks were not minor, they were profound. The investigation began uncovering details about conflicts, arguments, and tensions that had existed beneath the surface for years. Incidents that seemed small or trivial at the time suddenly took on new significance. Eyewitness accounts, private communications, and testimonies would gradually paint a picture of a family struggling with internal battles, pressures, and emotions that ultimately collided in the most catastrophic way possible. It is tempting to ask, how did things go so wrong? But the answer is never simple. Family dynamics are complex, a tangle of love, frustration, expectation, and individuality. Sometimes, even the smallest spark, an argument, a disagreement, a perceived slight, can ignite a chain of events with irreversible consequences. For the Reiners, that spark would be traced back to a night that, on the surface, seemed innocuous, but in reality, contained the seeds of disaster. In understanding the Reiner family life, it becomes clear that tragedy does not occur in a vacuum. The relationships, histories, pressures, and unspoken emotions all form a backdrop against which events unfold. No single detail can explain what happened, but each detail contributes to a fuller understanding. By examining their lives, their routines, interactions, and private moments, we begin to see not just the public image of the Reiners, but the private, fragile, human family that existed behind closed doors. And yet, despite all these complexities, nothing could have prepared anyone for what happened that Sunday. The world was about to witness a moment that would shatter not just a family, but a community, a city, and the very perception of safety and trust in seemingly perfect households. But what came next would shock even those closest to the family, and no one saw it coming. The night before the tragedy was meant to be ordinary, or at least ordinary by Los Angeles standards. A party at Conan O'Brien's home in the hills, the kind of gathering that blends casual conversation with celebrity glamour, laughter, and the subtle hum of privilege. Guests mingled under twinkling lights, sipping drinks, joking, sharing stories, oblivious to the catastrophe that would follow within hours. But for Rob Reiner, Michelle, and their son Nick, the evening would leave more than memories. It would leave clues, tensions, and a series of interactions that, in hindsight, would take on ominous significance. It's easy to imagine the scene. Well-known actors, comedians, and industry figures laughing in the spacious living areas, the soft glow of chandeliers reflecting off polished surfaces, music flowing softly in the background. Food stations stocked with gourmet treats, laughter echoing down hallways, friendly debates about movies, television, and politics. In public, such events appear idyllic, a momentary glimpse into a life most could only dream of. But underneath the laughter, human emotions, always unpredictable, are at work. According to sources who attended, there was a moment, brief, sharp, and easily dismissed, that would later dominate investigators' inquiries. A disagreement erupted between Rob and Nick. The details of the argument vary depending on the witness, but nearly all accounts agree on one thing. It was loud enough for multiple attendees to notice, charged enough to cast a temporary pall over the gathering. Some described it as a clash of opinions, perhaps over a joke, a comment, or something far more personal. Others suggested it was layered, rooted in deeper familial tension that had been simmering for years. The argument itself may have lasted only a few minutes, but in retrospect, its significance is undeniable. It was a crack in the family's polished veneer, a glimpse of friction that would later escalate into tragedy. Observers later described Nick as agitated, gesturing emphatically, his tone sharp. Rob, equally forceful, countered with the authority and confidence expected of a father, yet there was an unusual edge to the exchange. Michelle, reportedly nearby, attempted to diffuse the tension, her voice gentle, her gestures calm, but the moment was fleeting and the emotional undercurrent of the evening had shifted. By the end of the party, the argument had ostensibly concluded. Guests returned to conversations, laughter resumed, and the evening continued as if nothing had happened. Yet, beneath the surface, the interaction had planted a seed, a tension that would linger, unresolved, until it erupted the following morning. Family arguments are common, but rarely do they escalate into acts of violence. So what was different here? What invisible forces had been at work for weeks, months, and perhaps years that made this brief clash more than a passing moment of irritation? It is important to recognize that no single event occurs in isolation. The party, the argument, the interactions, each was part of a broader pattern. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances later described Nick as someone whose moods could swing unexpectedly, someone who might harbor resentment even amidst outward displays of affection. Rob, as a father and public figure, carried his own pressures, the weight of a career, a public persona, and the desire to maintain control and guidance over his adult son. Michelle, often the quiet mediator, balanced the household with empathy and care, but even the most patient individual has limits. What makes this night particularly striking is how ordinary it seemed to outsiders. To guests at the party, it may have been just a minor disagreement, one of many such moments in family life. But for those intimately connected, and for investigators examining the chain of events, it was the spark that would ignite a chain reaction. Every gesture, every word, every glance becomes significant. Who was in the room at the time? Who might have overheard? Could anyone have predicted that a casual remark or a brief clash of wills would precede a tragedy of such magnitude? Adding another layer to the night is the element of opportunity and timing. Parties, by their nature, provide anonymity within social interaction. Conversations can be overheard, misinterpreted, or forgotten. Yet each interaction leaves a trace, an impression, a memory, a subtle emotional impact that may later influence decisions and actions. For Nick Reiner, this night would become part of a larger psychological and emotional context that investigators would later examine in painstaking detail. Friends who later spoke to the press recalled moments of tension that evening that, at the time, seemed minor. Perhaps Nick made an offhand comment, a joke that landed poorly, or a remark that struck a nerve with his father. Perhaps Rob responded with humor meant to diffuse the situation, but the delivery was misinterpreted. Human emotions are complex, layered, and often misunderstood even among those closest to us. The Reiner family, like any family, was subject to these dynamics, and the night at Conan O'Brien's house became a microcosm of those underlying tensions. By the time the party concluded, the evening appeared to end on a neutral note. Guests departed, laughter resumed, and the city continued its night. But the emotional residue of that argument lingered. Family dynamics are rarely simple, and moments of conflict rarely vanish without leaving a mark. For Nick, these interactions may have contributed to feelings of anger, frustration, or perceived injustice, a cocktail of emotions that, when combined with other factors, would contribute to the actions he allegedly took hours later. Following the party, Nick returned to his own accommodations, reportedly reflecting on the evening. Sources later revealed that he checked into a hotel in Santa Monica early Sunday morning, just a few miles from his parents' home. These movements, seemingly mundane, are now part of a critical timeline that investigators would reconstruct piece by piece. Security footage, witness statements, and digital records provide a detailed account of his actions, but each piece also raises new questions. What was he thinking? What did he intend? And at what moment did the casual disagreements of the night turn into the irreversible decisions of the morning? Meanwhile, back in Brentwood, the Reiners' home remained silent, the calm before a storm. Michelle and Rob had yet to be confronted with the horror that would descend hours later. The contrast between the party, full of light, sound, and laughter, and the impending tragedy could not be more stark. It serves as a reminder that life can pivot in a single instant, that what seems ordinary may be the prelude to chaos. As investigators would later piece together, the events of that night were not isolated. They intersected with longer-term dynamics, emotional undercurrents, and subtle warning signs that had been present for months. Friends and family members recalled prior disagreements, minor tensions, and subtle signs of distress in Nick, none of which seemed alarming at the time, but now appear as ominous precursors. The night before was also a reflection of human complexity, the juxtaposition of normal social interaction with the undercurrents of conflict. It highlights the unpredictable nature of human behavior, the ways in which emotions, perceptions, and interactions can accumulate and eventually erupt. The argument at Conan O'Brien's party, brief and easily dismissed by outsiders, was a trigger, a spark in a chain reaction that would culminate in tragedy. And yet, even with hindsight, the events remain difficult to fully comprehend. Families argue, friends clash, tempers flare. These are ordinary aspects of life. But in this case, the ordinary transformed into the catastrophic. The night before serves as a haunting reminder that human emotions are volatile, that unresolved tensions can escalate in ways no one anticipates, and that moments of conflict, however minor they seem, can set the stage for irreversible consequences. By the time the city awoke on Sunday morning, the events of the night before would become critical pieces of the puzzle. The seemingly ordinary interactions at a social gathering were now being scrutinized by law enforcement, forensic analysts, and the public. Every word, every gesture, every fleeting moment was part of a chain of causation that led to one of the most shocking family tragedies in recent memory. But what happened in those hours after the party, leading to the early morning hours of Sunday, would push the story beyond comprehension. And the world would soon be forced to confront a reality that no one could have imagined. Sunday morning in Brentwood began like any other, or at least it appeared to. The streets were quiet, the sun barely peeking over the horizon, and the city moving slowly from the hush of night into the rhythm of day. But inside the Reiner household, the day would never unfold as ordinary. By dawn, an unthinkable tragedy had begun. A moment that would ripple outward, affecting family, friends, law enforcement, and the public in ways no one could have imagined. It was in the early hours of Sunday morning that Nick Reiner allegedly carried out the act that would forever alter his family's lives. According to investigators, this was not a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was an event with a sequence, a timeline, and a chain of actions that they are still piecing together. What began with an argument the night before, seemingly minor, now manifested as something far more sinister. Every detail, the movements, the choices, the timing, would become critical in understanding the magnitude of what happened. Authorities have reconstructed the initial hours with painstaking detail. After leaving Conan O'Brien's party, Nick reportedly returned briefly to his own accommodations. From there, surveillance footage shows him moving through the city, eventually checking into a hotel in Santa Monica around 2 a.m. This location, just 4 miles from the family's Brentwood home, became a focal point in understanding his movements. Investigators believe these hours were marked by a mix of deliberation, anxiety, and planning, a period in which the final moments before the tragedy were quietly orchestrated. It is impossible to overstate the chilling nature of this timeline. The city slept unaware that within mere miles, a family's fate was being decided. The normal sounds of morning, cars rolling down streets, coffee shops preparing for the day, people walking dogs, contrasted sharply with the darkness unfolding behind closed doors. Such contrasts, mundane on the surface, are a haunting reminder of how violence can erupt unexpectedly, even in the most ordinary settings. Around 3:40 a.m., sources indicate that Nick allegedly entered the Brentwood home, carrying with him a knife, a weapon that would later define the charges against him. Details about the interaction inside the home remain limited, but the outcome is tragically clear. Rob and Michelle Reiner were fatally stabbed. The violence was swift, precise, and devastating. Every movement, every strike, represents a moment of irreversible consequence. In the aftermath, investigators would seek to reconstruct not just the physical actions, but the psychological state that led to them. The question of motive becomes particularly urgent at this point. Authorities have yet to release an official explanation for why Nick allegedly committed the murders, but eyewitness accounts from the previous night provide tantalizing clues. The argument at the party, minor in appearance, may have been a trigger. But triggers alone do not explain such extreme behavior. Investigators are exploring a range of factors, from personal grievances to psychological stressors, and even potential underlying mental health issues. Each theory, each hypothesis, must be weighed against the facts of the case and the observable evidence. Once the alleged murders occurred, Nick's actions continued in a manner that suggests both awareness and evasion. He did not immediately flee the scene aimlessly. Security footage and witness accounts indicate that he traveled to a Santa Monica hotel, checked in, and then moved again, ultimately ending up in Exposition Park, where he was arrested later that evening. These movements raise profound questions. Was he in shock? Was he attempting to escape? Or was he calculating his next steps with a deliberate mind? Each movement provides clues about his mental state and intentions. The authorities' discovery of the bodies at 3:40 p.m. marked the beginning of a formal investigation. For neighbors who had been accustomed to seeing the family move about with grace and normalcy, the scene was jarring. Law enforcement officials described the crime scene as precise yet chaotic, indicative of intense emotional energy and, according to experts, a high level of personal involvement by the perpetrator. It was not a random act of violence. It was personal, direct, and intimate in a way that magnifies the horror. Public reaction was swift once the news became known. Social media exploded with speculation, disbelief, and sorrow. Headlines emphasized the shocking nature of the crime, the high-profile status of the Reiners, and the extraordinary circumstances surrounding Nick's arrest. To the public, it was a story that seemed impossible to reconcile with their perception of a loving, seemingly functional family. But the unfolding timeline of the early morning paints a starkly different reality. A family's love undermined by a series of events, emotions, and actions that culminated in tragedy. Adding to the complexity are the logistical and forensic details that investigators pursued in the early hours. Forensic teams began meticulously documenting the scene, collecting evidence, and reconstructing the sequence of events. Each trace of blood, each position of objects, and every mark on surfaces tells a story. In combination with witness accounts and surveillance footage, this evidence forms a mosaic that law enforcement would analyze for weeks, searching for patterns, motives, and explanations. Nick's post-crime movements also attracted intense scrutiny. Travel from Brentwood to Santa Monica, and later to Exposition Park, was captured on cameras, providing a clear, almost cinematic trail of movement. These moments, otherwise mundane in a city of millions, become chilling in retrospect. Investigators began to map his path minute by minute, using digital records, CCTV footage, and witness statements. Every step taken, every decision made, became a potential clue in understanding both the crime and the individual who allegedly committed it. The broader psychological impact of this timeline is significant. When we attempt to understand human behavior, particularly in extreme circumstances, the temporal sequence of actions becomes crucial. How did one brief argument escalate into violence? How did a son transition from attending a social gathering to allegedly committing the ultimate act of betrayal against his parents? These questions are not abstract. They speak to the core of what happened, and they frame the investigative and narrative efforts that would dominate media coverage and public discourse. By early Sunday morning, 2 lives were lost, and 1 life had crossed a point of no return. The world was on the brink of discovering the shocking details, but for investigators, friends, and neighbors, the reality was even starker. What seemed like an ordinary morning had become a crime scene of unprecedented emotional and public impact. Every subsequent revelation would be viewed through the lens of these early hours, the calm before, the tension during, and the chaos afterward. And as the timeline of that morning unfolded, it became clear that Nick's story was far from over. His actions did not end with the murders. Authorities would soon trace his movements, reconstruct his decisions, and reveal a series of steps that added layers of complexity to an already shocking narrative. How someone could move from private anger to public exposure, from a familial confrontation to a highly visible arrest, is a question that would dominate the investigation and media coverage in equal measure. But even with all the facts collected, all the footage reviewed, and all the statements taken, one chilling reality remains. Nothing about this early Sunday morning was ordinary. Every action, every choice, every movement played a role in a tragedy that defied expectation, logic, and reason. And the story that would follow, the legal battles, prison incidents, and public fascination, would be rooted in those early hours, where a chain reaction of decisions set the stage for events that no one could have predicted. But what came next would push the narrative beyond understanding. and the world was about to witness the beginning of a saga that would shock Los Angeles and the nation alike. At 3:40 p.m. on Sunday, Brentwood time seemed to stop. The quiet streets, the warm California sun, and the ordinary routines of the afternoon were shattered when authorities discovered the unthinkable: the lifeless bodies of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner inside their own home. For neighbors, friends, and anyone following the story, the horror of the discovery marked the first concrete confrontation with the tragic reality. This was no rumor, no social media exaggeration. It was real. Two people, prominent, respected, and beloved, were gone, and the crime scene inside the Reiner home became a focal point for shock, grief, and investigation. Imagine walking up to a house that has always radiated calm and safety, only to be met with flashing lights, the quiet hum of emergency vehicles, and officers moving with precision and solemnity. Law enforcement cordoned off the area quickly, aware that high-profile cases attract both attention and complications. Inside, the scene was meticulously documented. Every angle, every detail, every item was treated as potential evidence. For investigators, the first step was understanding what had happened, how, when, and by whom. The first officers on the scene described an atmosphere thick with tension. The home, which just hours earlier had been filled with life and warmth, now seemed eerie and still. Furniture, personal items, and photographs told a story of a family that was ordinary in its humanity, yet extraordinary in its accomplishments. And yet, in the midst of this everyday domesticity, the signs of violence were unmistakable. The knives, the positions of the bodies, and the lack of forced entry all pointed toward someone familiar, a personal, intimate crime. It was not random. It was targeted, deliberate, and devastatingly direct. News of the discovery spread quickly. By mid-afternoon, neighbors had gathered, whispering, speculating, and trying to reconcile the tragedy with the familiar faces they had seen every day. For many, it was impossible to comprehend. How could such violence occur in a neighborhood known for its security, in a home that had always seemed so protected? How could a family that appeared to function with love and care be ripped apart in a matter of hours? These questions, unanswered at the time, would fuel headlines, social media discussions, and public fascination for weeks to come. Police interviews and early reports confirmed that Rob and Michelle had been stabbed multiple times. The lethal nature of the wounds indicated intense anger and personal involvement. This was not an accidental confrontation, nor was it a struggle with an intruder. According to investigators, the crime scene suggested someone who knew the victims intimately, someone whose actions were driven by more than impulse, a perpetrator intimately familiar with both the layout of the home and the routines of those inside. Forensic teams began the painstaking process of documenting every detail. Blood spatter analysis, fingerprints, and the placement of objects all became critical to reconstructing the events. In high-profile cases such as this, the pressure on investigators is immense. Every decision, every observation, and every hypothesis is scrutinized both internally and by the public. These early hours are crucial, setting the foundation for a case that will inevitably go under intense legal and media examination. Neighbors who had known the family for years expressed disbelief. Many described Rob and Michelle as generous, kind, and devoted parents. The contrast between this perception and the violence that had occurred inside the home created a profound sense of cognitive dissonance. How could two people who seemed so grounded, so loving, be victims of such brutality? It was a question without an immediate answer, but one that would haunt the investigation from the very beginning. Authorities also began tracing digital and physical footprints. Cell phone records, hotel check-ins, and surveillance footage from nearby locations were analyzed to track Nick Reiner's movements. Investigators discovered that he had checked into a Santa Monica hotel early that morning, a mere 4 miles from the Brentwood home. Further footage showed him at a gas station prior to his arrest. Each movement, once seemingly ordinary, became a critical piece of the puzzle. Every action after the murders raised questions about intent, planning, and the psychological state of the individual involved. The media quickly picked up the story, intensifying public scrutiny. Reports highlighted the contrast between the family's public image and the shocking nature of the crime. Social media platforms erupted with speculation, theories, and condolences, and the public began piecing together timelines, motives, and connections. But while headlines captured attention, the investigators on the ground focused on something more precise: evidence, sequences, and facts. They worked to distinguish between rumor and reality, between assumption and demonstrable truth. As details emerged, one theme became clear: this was a crime defined by its intimacy and precision. Unlike random acts of violence, there was no indication of forced entry, robbery, or external motive. The perpetrator was likely someone the victims knew, someone with access, and someone capable of navigating both the physical space of the home and the emotional terrain of the family. For law enforcement, this knowledge helped narrow the field of investigation, but it also intensified the emotional weight of the case. Friends of the Reiners were devastated. Interviews revealed a mix of disbelief, sorrow, and attempts to reconcile public perception with the private reality. Some spoke of Nick as a caring son, while others admitted noticing tension in the family over time. The juxtaposition of outward normalcy with inner turmoil became a focal point of both media coverage and public fascination. The narrative was no longer just about a crime. It was about betrayal, family dynamics, and the fragility of what we often take for granted. As investigators continued to process the scene, one element stood out above all: the timeline. Every detail from the previous night and the early morning hours had converged in a single, devastating outcome. Each interaction, each decision, each unspoken tension became a piece of a larger story, a story that would continue to unfold in ways no one anticipated. The discovery of the crime was only the beginning, the moment when private tragedy became public narrative, and when speculation, grief, and investigation intersected in a way that would grip the city and the nation. By the time Nick Reiner was located and arrested later that evening, law enforcement already had a growing understanding of the sequence of events. But the public was left with more questions than answers. Why did this happen? Could it have been prevented? And what would the next steps reveal about both the perpetrator and the family he destroyed? The discovery of the crime set in motion a chain of events that would dominate headlines, influence public perception, and challenge the limits of comprehension. Every subsequent development, arrest, prison incidents, court filings, would trace back to this moment. The Reiner family home, once a symbol of stability and success, had become a site of tragedy, investigation, and shocking revelation. And yet, even as authorities documented the scene and began their meticulous work, a new twist was looming, one that would push the story beyond the initial shock and into a realm of danger, legal complexity, and public fascination. But what came next would expose not just the crime, but the wider consequences, and the world would soon learn that the story of the Reiners was far from over. By 9:15 p.m. Sunday evening, the drama that had begun in the quiet early hours of the morning reached its first public crescendo. Nick Reiner, the 32-year-old son of Rob and Michelle Singer Reiner, was found and arrested in the Exposition Park neighborhood of South Los Angeles. The city, already reeling from the discovery of his parents' deaths, now had a tangible face for the crime: a young man, charged with the very act that had shattered a family and captured the nation's attention. The arrest was swift, precise, and, for many watching from the outside, chilling in its clarity. The timeline leading up to the arrest is crucial to understanding the gravity of the situation. After allegedly committing the murders in Brentwood, Nick did not immediately vanish into obscurity. Surveillance footage from the early morning hours shows him entering a Santa Monica hotel, only 4 miles from his parents' home. From there, investigators tracked him to a local gas station, moments before law enforcement moved in to take him into custody. Each movement, meticulously documented, paints a portrait of a man aware of the consequences of his actions, yet compelled to follow a path that would ultimately lead to his capture. When police approached him, Nick was calm, cooperative, and, to those observing, almost eerily composed. Officers later described him as neither confrontational nor panicked, a demeanor that some found unsettling given the gravity of the alleged crimes. The arrest itself was straightforward. He was taken into custody without incident, handcuffed, and transported to a secure facility for questioning. In high-profile cases like this, the procedures are designed not only to secure the suspect, but also to ensure that every legal safeguard is followed, creating a foundation for the investigation and subsequent prosecution. The charges were immediately severe. 2 counts of first-degree murder with special circumstances, including an allegation that he personally used a deadly weapon, a knife. The language used by law enforcement and the district attorney's office was deliberate, emphasizing both the seriousness of the crime and the personal involvement of the accused. These charges would define the legal trajectory of the case, setting the stage for an investigation and trial that would attract intense public scrutiny. Public reaction to the arrest was swift and polarized. Social media platforms exploded with commentary. Shock, disbelief, sympathy, and speculation all mingled in a chaotic flood. To many, the idea that a son could commit such an act against his parents was incomprehensible. Others speculated on motives, mental health factors, or family dynamics, attempting to reconcile the outwardly normal image of the Reiner family with the violent reality of the crime. Headlines emphasized the contrast between Nick's public persona and the alleged acts, further fueling a narrative of tragedy, betrayal, and shock. In the hours following the arrest, law enforcement worked to piece together the details. Investigators interviewed witnesses from the party the night before, traced Nick's movements via hotel records and surveillance cameras, and began reconstructing the sequence of events leading up to the murders. Every detail, no matter how minor, was treated as potentially crucial evidence. The combination of digital footprints, eyewitness accounts, and physical evidence created a timeline that, while incomplete in some areas, provided a foundation for understanding the scope and nature of the alleged crimes. Friends and family members reacted with a mixture of disbelief and grief. Some described Nick as kind and gentle, while others admitted to noticing tensions between him and his parents over time. These conflicting accounts highlight the complexity of human relationships, especially within families where love, expectation, and individual personality intersect. It is precisely this complexity that makes cases like this both compelling and confounding. The same person can be both loved and feared, both admired and resented. Legal experts began weighing in almost immediately, discussing the potential trajectory of the case and the severity of the charges. First-degree murder with special circumstances carries the harshest potential penalties under California law, including life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The inclusion of the allegation that Nick personally used a knife underscores the personal and violent nature of the act, which has significant implications for both sentencing and the trial process. The arrest also set in motion a series of logistical challenges for law enforcement and the judicial system. High-profile cases attract attention not only from the public, but also from media organizations, advocacy groups, and legal experts. Every statement, every piece of evidence, and every procedural decision becomes part of a broader narrative, scrutinized and analyzed in real time. The need for precision, adherence to protocol, and careful management of information becomes critical, ensuring that the investigation proceeds without jeopardizing future prosecution. As Nick was transported to the detention facility, questions about his mental state, intentions, and motivations began to dominate both media coverage and public discourse. Why did this happen? Was it premeditated? Could it have been prevented? Each question was met with speculation, yet the answers remained elusive. What investigators had in terms of physical evidence and digital tracking was only part of the story. The human element, the emotional and psychological dimension, remained a puzzle yet to be fully understood. Even as the legal machinery began to take shape, one additional layer added urgency and gravity to the situation: Nick's health and safety while in custody. High-profile suspects, particularly those charged with violent crimes, can be at risk in detention facilities. The environment is tense, and inmates charged with serious offenses are often targeted. Reports of potential altercations or attacks in custody would later surface, raising concerns about his immediate safety and foreshadowing further complications in the unfolding narrative. The arrest also sparked broader questions about family dynamics and the warning signs that might have been missed. Friends, neighbors, and the public began dissecting past interactions, arguing over whether any red flags had been ignored or misunderstood. While hindsight offers clarity, it also amplifies grief and shock. Every minor disagreement, every past tension, every subtle sign became part of the story that investigators, journalists, and the public attempted to reconstruct. By the end of that Sunday evening, the initial shock had transformed into a combination of grief, fascination, and scrutiny. Nick Reiner, once a son in a prominent family, was now a defendant in one of the most shocking murder cases in recent memory. The contrast between the normalcy of his life just days earlier and the weight of the charges he faced was stark. The arrest, precise and inevitable, marked a pivotal moment in the story, but it was only the beginning. Investigators knew that the arrest did not answer all questions. In fact, it raised new ones. What drove him to commit the act? What were his movements and intentions after the murders? How would he fare in the high-security environment of a detention facility? Each answer promised to reveal more about the tragedy and the complex human dynamics at its core. But what came next would thrust Nick Reiner into a new realm of danger, legal complexity, and public scrutiny, and the full consequences of that night were far from over. Understanding why a son allegedly killed his own parents is not just a question of curiosity. It is a puzzle with psychological, social, and legal dimensions. Investigators, legal experts, and psychologists would all grapple with the same central question. What drove Nick Reiner to commit an act so violent, so intimate, that it shocked the nation? The investigation into motive would become as critical as the physical evidence itself, as it offered context to a crime that, on the surface, seemed incomprehensible. The first step in motive investigation began immediately after the arrest. Law enforcement meticulously reconstructed Nick's interactions leading up to the murders, examining the night before at Conan O'Brien's party, previous arguments, and any behavioral patterns that might offer insight. Witnesses reported that the father-son clash at the gathering, though brief, was unusually heated. Some described Nick's tone as sharp, frustrated, almost desperate. Rob, in response, reportedly maintained a firm, authoritative stance. Typical for a father, but perceived differently, depending on perspective. These accounts provided initial clues, but left investigators questioning the broader psychological landscape that could have led to violence. Family dynamics were scrutinized in detail. Friends and relatives painted a complex picture of the Reiners, outwardly close-knit and supportive, yet punctuated by disagreements, unmet expectations, and occasional tension. Nick, like many sons navigating adulthood, faced pressures from a father with immense professional legacy and a mother who often acted as mediator. In isolation, these pressures are typical, but combined with other potential stressors, personal ambitions, public scrutiny, emotional struggles, they could create a volatile mix. The investigators knew they were looking for patterns, not just isolated incidents. Financial and social pressures were also considered. Nick Reiner, despite the privileges of his upbringing, was an adult with aspirations, responsibilities, and personal goals. Sources indicated that he maintained connections with high-profile social circles, some of which exposed him to envy, comparison, and subtle competition. In families with wealth and fame, the line between support and expectation is often blurred. Investigators examined whether such pressures, combined with personal frustrations, contributed to a mindset capable of extreme action. Digital footprints became another critical element in motive analysis. Emails, messages, and social media interactions offered glimpses into Nick's state of mind in the days, weeks, and months preceding the tragedy. Subtle signs, complaints, emotional venting, expressions of frustration or isolation were reviewed for patterns that might illuminate his motivations. Experts cautioned that while digital evidence can be telling, it requires careful interpretation. Emotional outbursts online do not always translate to violent intent, yet in this case, every detail demanded attention. Psychological factors were heavily weighed. Investigators and behavioral analysts considered whether Nick exhibited traits of emotional instability, impulsivity, or unresolved trauma. Childhood experiences, parental expectations, and family communication styles can all influence adult behavior, particularly under stress. While no single factor justifies or excuses the alleged crime, understanding these elements provides critical context. Experts noted that premeditation, as suggested by the timeline and post-crime movements, pointed to complex emotional and cognitive processing rather than a purely impulsive act. The argument at Conan O'Brien's party became a focal point for examining motive. While minor disputes are common in any family, law enforcement treated this incident as potentially catalytic. Interviews suggested the disagreement was not only loud but emotionally charged, touching on underlying resentment or perceived grievances. In cases of familial homicide, seemingly small triggers often interact with long-term stressors and emotional history, resulting in outcomes that are both sudden and catastrophic. Friends and acquaintances offered additional perspectives. Some recalled moments where Nick seemed frustrated with perceived expectations or felt overshadowed by his father's legacy. Others emphasized that Nick was normally polite, reserved, and socially aware, which made the alleged violence even more confounding. The disparity between external behavior and internal emotional state became a central focus. Investigators sought to map not just what Nick did, but why he might have acted in ways incongruent with his usual personality. Legal experts explained that establishing motive can significantly influence both prosecution strategy and public perception. While motive is not required to prove guilt, it helps frame the narrative of intent, premeditation, and personal involvement. In this case, first-degree murder charges with special circumstances suggest that prosecutors were confident in the argument for intent and deliberation. Motive, while multifaceted and complex, bolsters the understanding of how an intimate family relationship transformed into a lethal confrontation. Investigators also explored potential external factors. Were there influences outside the family, friends, associates, financial stressors, or personal conflicts that might have contributed? Every lead was examined, every interaction scrutinized. While the central relationship was clearly between Nick and his parents, understanding the broader environment could shed light on contributing pressures, emotional triggers, and potential warning signs that were missed. Ultimately, the investigation into motive revealed the complexity of human behavior, particularly in high-pressure, high-stakes environments. It became clear that a combination of factors, long-standing family tension, perceived pressures, psychological stressors, and the immediate argument at the party, likely converged to create the conditions for tragedy. While investigators continued to analyze evidence and testimony, they emphasized that human behavior, particularly in intimate settings, is rarely linear. One moment of conflict can interact with decades of unresolved tension to produce outcomes that defy conventional understanding. The search for motive also had emotional implications for friends, neighbors, and the public. Understanding why the murders occurred is not just a legal necessity. It is a psychological and emotional need. People struggle to reconcile love, expectation, and betrayal in cases where a son allegedly kills his own parents. The investigation forced everyone connected, professionals, family friends, and the media, to confront uncomfortable questions about human nature, family dynamics, and the unpredictable consequences of unresolved conflict. And yet, even as investigators focused on motive, the story was far from complete. Other chapters were emerging: Nick's time in custody, potential threats he faced, and further revelations about the Reiner family's private life. Each new detail would layer onto the narrative, deepening the tragedy, complicating the investigation, and keeping public attention riveted. But what investigators would discover next, the interactions, movements, and tensions surrounding Nick's time in prison, would push the story into an even darker, more dangerous territory. The world may have thought the arrest was the climax of the Reiner tragedy, but for Nick Reiner, it was only the beginning of a new, more perilous chapter. Once inside the correctional system, the stark reality of prison life began to unfold, a reality far removed from the privilege, freedom, and social circles he had known. Within hours, Nick would confront threats, dangers, and psychological pressures that are part and parcel of incarceration, especially for high-profile suspects charged with violent crimes. The first days in custody are critical for any inmate, but for someone like Nick, charged with killing his own parents, the stakes were exponentially higher. Correctional officers are trained to anticipate risk, and inmates charged with particularly heinous crimes often face immediate isolation to protect them from both external threats and internal destabilization. For Nick, this meant being placed in a high-security unit, where surveillance is constant, routines are controlled, and every interaction is monitored. From the outside, prison may appear as simply a place of confinement, but inside, the environment is a complex web of hierarchy, reputation, and power dynamics. Inmates who commit crimes against family members are often viewed as pariahs, targeted by others for their perceived betrayal or weakness. Nick, by virtue of both his alleged actions and his public profile, faced an environment rife with danger. Any misstep, any perceived vulnerability, could become a target for aggression. Within the first 24 hours, sources indicate that Nick experienced threats from fellow inmates. Whispers, stares, and subtle movements all contributed to an atmosphere of tension. For those unfamiliar with the prison environment, it is easy to underestimate how quickly psychological pressure accumulates. High-profile inmates, particularly those charged with family homicides, must navigate not only their own guilt, fear, and anxiety, but also the calculated hostility of others. Every action, even minor, is scrutinized, and every opportunity for manipulation or intimidation is exploited. Security protocols are designed to mitigate risk, but they cannot eliminate it entirely. Officers monitor behavior, conduct regular cell checks, and maintain control over movements. Yet the social dynamics of the inmate population remain fluid and unpredictable. For Nick, understanding these dynamics was critical to survival. In a world where reputation can dictate safety, he had to quickly learn the unspoken rules, the delicate balance between appearing vulnerable and overreacting. Each choice had consequences, and in some cases, the consequences were violent. According to sources, within days of his arrival, Nick was involved in an altercation with another inmate. The details remain somewhat obscure due to security and privacy concerns, but the incident reportedly involved a verbal confrontation that escalated, leaving Nick physically threatened.